So we're delighted to welcome back Natalie Bennett, who's the leader of the Green Party, and back to Leicester. She's been elected as leader of the Green Party since 2012, and she's also been coordinator of the Camden Greens and founding chair of the Green Party's Women's Group. And in the 2015 election, she stood in Holborn and St Pancras and won 13% of the vote. Natalie is also no stranger to Leicester, having studied here. She received an MA in Mass Communication at the university in 2001. And I understand that since studying here, Natalie has been an avid supporter of both the Foxes and the Tigers, but maybe that's not really true. So without further ado, I'd quite like to introduce Natalie Bennett.
Thank you very much, Mags, and I do have to actually explain that whole football thing, because we all know what happens when political leaders declare that they support a particular football team. They get into lots of trouble. So I made a conscious decision not to do that. What I usually do is, when journalists ask me which team I support, I have a simple answer to that, which is, well, you know, I don't have time these days to follow any particular team. Indeed, you know, I believe in a work-life balance. I just don't have one. You know, back in the day, I used to be a very keen footballer. I was a quite decent goalkeeper, although I was always a bit too short to cover my top corners. And when I say that to male journalists, they inevitably take a step back, look shocked, then realise they're not supposed to look shocked, which is a great way to get a journalist on the back foot. But anyway, thank you very much, Mags, for that introduction. And it is lovely to be back in Leicester. I was reflecting back on previous visits here, and one of which my fond memories is Queen's Road, and visiting the lovely local independent shops there. And I particularly remember a local knitting shop that was a really lovely little haven. And you know, from a distance I heard the victory that you defeated Tesco, so well done for that. But I should also sort of declare as a matter of honesty that I did my degree through Leicester, but I did it as an external student. I was actually in Bangkok when I started my MA, so I'm not claiming to be an expert on Leicester. But what I can talk about, and one of the things that I'll focus on tonight, is the whole issue that Mags was raising of political reform, of the failures of our electoral system. And the fact is that you know, here in Leicester, you're a great example of just how much our electoral system is actually failing people. So many people vote year after year, and they're just never represented. Their candidates are never elected. Now, in terms of local elections, that's clear. But in terms of national elections, the state we're in now politically, let's look at it very simply. We have a Tory government inflicting hideous austerity, making terrible decisions about energy policy that will have impacts far into the future, inflicting on us an EU referendum in a very short period of time without time for proper debate. And the Tory government that's doing that is doing it without any kind of mandate, any kind of right to be doing it. They have the support of 24% of eligible voters around the country. What they're doing to our junior doctors, to our nursing students, what they're doing to people with the cuts to benefits, the new benefit cap that's coming in that's going to make many, many people homeless. Everything that they're doing, pulling the rug out from underneath those small businesses in renewable energy and energy conservation with their changes in policy. They simply don't have a mandate for any of those things. And then, you know, in terms of local elections, we have what are known as one-party states. And as Mags was saying, that's deeply unhealthy in terms of just quality of governance. You usually have elected mayors or cabinet systems, backbenchers from the ruling party just rubber stamp things through, no questions are asked. And I would say, you know, even when the Greens are running things, it's always good if there's someone questioning, saying, couldn't you do this a bit better? How could you do this differently? The residents are saying to us they're really concerned, what should you do? And you know, even electing one Green can make a huge difference. Down in Islington in North London, there's one Green councillor, Caroline Russell. There's one Green councillor and 47 Labour councillors. She is the opposition on Islington Council. And you know what? Labour's running a bit scared. About the third full meeting of the council, Caroline mustered through 12 different community groups, asking questions, challenging the council, and because she was there as a councillor, she was able to help and support. And that's something that is really important. You can do from outside, as I know you're doing here in Leicester, but it's really important to be able to get people elected. And that's what we're aiming to do in the Green Party, because one of the things the Green Party has traditionally done is we've been the ideas leader in politics. If you think back a decade or so, 20-mile-per-hour speed limits where people live, work and shop. People said, oh, it's those radical Greens and their crazy ideas. And then it was a living wage, and here I mean a real living wage, not George Osborne's fake living wage. A decade or so ago we were saying, councils should become living wage employers. We should fight for everyone to get a real living wage. And people said, oh, crazy Greens and their radical ideas. And yet now, 10 years or so later, you look at the City of London, possibly the least radical place you could imagine. The City of London is now entirely 20-mile-per-hour speed limits. Living wage, you've actually got, and I've heard them, executives from Barclays Bank extolling the virtues of a living wage and how great it is that they actually retain staff and the staff are better paid and it's more productive, and a living wage is a wonderful idea. So in the Green Party we're used to coming up with ideas and seeing other people adopt them. And I'm often asked, do you mind other people stealing your ideas? And my short answer to that is no, I don't. I'm in politics to change things. That's why I'm here. But the fact is, the way we are now in Britain, the state of our politics that I've already been referring to, the state of our economy, society, the state of our environment, they're in a really bad way, and the kind of change that we need needs to be much faster than what we've been getting. We need real political change. And one of the really exciting things we're seeing is that more and more people are really getting engaged in politics, getting focused on politics, doing politics. And that's a message that I have for everybody, a message to I'd urge everyone to take away, and it's not a party political message. It's a message that says politics should be something you do. Don't have politics done to you. Because at the moment we're all having politics done to us by this unelected, unmandated Tory government. And that's what we've got happening. Now, just a really good example of this, of how people can get engaged now with the new possibilities of social media, the new technology that's available to us. Just after the election, a 17-year-old from Cornwall called Owen Winter, he's a member of the Youth Parliament, and he started a petition. He was so fed up with the least proportional election result in British history that he started a petition to say, we want electoral reform. And about 2 weeks later, 230,000 people had signed that 17-year-old's petition for electoral reform. And so I can actually thank Owen for the fact that I joined other party leaders outside number 10 Downing Street to deliver those 230,000 signatures. And so I can thank Owen for giving Nigel Farage the chance to photobomb me. I don't know why Nigel Farage wanted to photobomb me, but it was in the Mirror if you want to look the picture up. But people are getting engaged, are really fed up with the way things are. And there's really no surprise about that. When you think about the fact, the state of our economy, we're still talking about, we really must do something about those too big to fail banks. 2016, nearly 8 years after the financial crisis, and we still really must do something about those too big to fail banks. You look at the state of our society. Trussell Trust records 1 million visits to food banks in 1 year. This in the world's 6th richest economy. And one of the things that I do in lots of my visits around the country is visit food banks. And there's a story there, just a continually growing story of pressure, of need, of desperation. It actually was in the East Midlands a year or so back. I visited one food bank, a story that stuck with me. It was a single father of 2. He'd gone to the cash machine to buy that week's food and discovered there was no money. So he went down to the job centre and said, oh, why is there no money? And perhaps surprisingly, the stories aren't always this clear. They said to him, oh, you didn't come to an appointment. Oh, hang on, we've realised we texted the message for this to the wrong number. Sorry about that. You'll have some money in a couple of weeks' time. And this is a single father of 2 with no food in the cupboard. And luckily someone referred him to the food bank. But he arrived at the food bank in such a condition that the people at the food bank, the volunteers there, they all remembered him, they were all really worried about him. And that's the kind of thing we're doing to people. Benefit sanctions, 0 hours contracts, jobs that simply don't pay people enough money to live on. That's the way Britain is today. And then, of course, the environmental crisis. And when you come to the environment, of course, climate change is the natural place to start. But the whole environmental crisis is about so much more than that. Just one example, some figures done by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation a few weeks ago now, that said by 2050, the weight of plastics in the oceans will be greater than the weight of fish. We've turned our oceans into a plastic soup. One of the little campaigns that I'm running that's a great campaign to spread the word around, because anyone can really campaign on it, is something called microbeads, which are tiny little bits of plastic that are now in lots of facial scrubs, body scrubs, toothpastes, tiny fragments of plastic. And they just go straight into our water supply, straight through our sewerage system, out into the oceans. And you know what? The US has actually announced a ban on microbeads. Quite an astonishing development. Not just the US Democrats, but the US Republicans unanimously agreed a ban on microbeads over Christmas. And yet, what have we got in Britain? We've got a government that says, oh yes, we're working with industry to gradually agree a phase out with the industry. And I was looking up something this afternoon, and the industry says, oh, we reckon we might be able to do it by 2020. We'll just keep plumping the plastic out until then. The loss of biodiversity, the fact that we've lost 50% of the wild animals in the world in the past few decades. There's half the wild animal population that there used to be. We've got a real environmental crisis. And, of course, a lot of our climate change, when we get back to climate change, is the issue of energy policy. Now, it is worth saying that when we think about tackling climate change, when you take a global perspective, there's really lots of good news out there. The Paris climate talks, better result than anyone actually expected. We weren't expecting them to come away saying, we all agree, and remember every world leader signed up to this, we agree that we're going to try and limit climate change to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. That was what they agreed to. And in Britain, we've had a strong reminder over the Christmas period of why we need to do that. We're living in a 1 degree warmed world now, and we had the floods that we had over Christmas. And 0.5 degree isn't half as bad again. The impacts of this are exponential, they just keep getting worse. But around the rest of the world, lots of exciting things are happening. One of my favourite figures is from China. Last year in China, 48% of the new electricity generation installed was renewables. China was one of the real forces pushing for a decent deal in Paris, whereas if you go back to Copenhagen, they've been very much part of the barriers. We've got real change happening. And then in Britain, we have a government that loves the idea of fracking. I've been to many places around the country, Balcombe, Barton Moss, Upton, over near Chester, and one of the things that the government's love of fracking has done is it's really helped to build not just an anti-fracking movement, but a movement that's built growing awareness of climate change. One of the things that I saw particularly in Upton, now Chester is a fairly wealthy kind of place, and there were lots of people there with accents that I can't really imitate, but one of them who I met there back before the European election, and she said to me, well, I voted Tory all my life, but since I found out about fracking and I found out about climate change, well, I'm voting Green now. And she was far too polite to say so, but I think, you could see the pattern. It started off, my house price. What will this do to my house price? And then before she knew it, she'd actually been sitting around a campfire with people in dreadlocks, talking about fracking, finding out about climate change. And you wouldn't exactly say she'd turned into a climate warrior, but she was definitely heading in that direction. And indeed, you might have seen that over Christmas period, the Upton Protection Camp, which was the longest in existence protection camp around Britain, faced eviction and was evicted. But I went up there just before the eviction to show my support. And I met, wasn't this woman, but perhaps one of her very similar neighbours, who was saying to me, you know, we really want to support the camp. We don't want them evicted, we want to support them, but you know, we're not really the sort of people who stand in front of bulldozers. And I said, that's fine. Bake some cakes for the people who are going to stand in front of the bulldozers. And they went, oh yes, that's all right, we can do that. Baking cakes, we can cope with that. And so one of the things that we've really seen with the whole government's focus on fracking, and it's really interesting that this government has, you know, bet its whole future thinking about energy, Britain's energy, fracking's the future. And yet I've spoken to lots of people from the energy industry, both pro-fracking and anti-fracking, and none of them think that fracked gas will be any significant part of Britain's energy future. People know what we need to do, we know what we need to do. That's renewable energy, wind, on and offshore, solar, but above all, and the big forgotten thing, because it's kind of unsexy and doesn't sound very exciting, but it really is critical, and that's energy conservation. The best possible energy we can have, the cleanest, greenest, best possible energy, is the energy we don't need to use. So, and this is a really good example of a broader point, which is the kind of solutions to the problems we've got now, the economic, the social and the environmental. It used to be perhaps the theory was, oh, you know, we need to fix the economic and the social, and then we'll have the luxury of dealing with the environment. But actually, these are all problems caused by our current economic system, caused by our current approach of privatisation, our current whole, give it a label, neoliberal, neo-Thatcherite approach. And the solutions tackle all of these problems together. And the obvious way of thinking about this is, think about fuel poverty. Now, we have the second worst level of fuel poverty in Western Europe. We can proclaim that we're not as bad as Lithuania. Now, that's not because our energy is actually particularly expensive. It's actually because we have a really poor quality of housing stock. That particularly affects our older citizens and is one of the key reasons why we've got absolutely obscene excess winter death rates. But it also affects many young people. When I talk to a group of students and say, student housing, lots of it's not very well insulated, this kind of a sympathetic shudder normally goes around the room at that point. Now, if we were to invest in energy conservation, insulation, energy conservation measures in every home that needed it, treat housing as part of our national infrastructure, then if you look at, there's something called the Energy Bill Revolution that sets this out in detail. We could lift 9 out of 10 households out of fuel poverty, we could cut our carbon emissions, and we could create up to 100,000 jobs. It's a total no-brainer. You think about solar. Now, soon after the government cut the solar feed-in tariff, suddenly, radically, I was up in Rotherham visiting an electrical installer up there. And great guy, 34 years old, had been installing solar panels since 2007, had his own business, had trained 4 apprentices, had been looking to take on more apprentices to grow and develop his business. And then, swoosh, the government pulled the rug out from under him with the cuts to the feed-in tariff. Now actually, solar has been doing extremely well in Britain, and no one doubts that it won't in another couple of years be able to do extremely well again. But the sudden drop in the feed-in tariff has left business people like him absolutely stranded. Although actually, luckily, he's not absolutely stranded because he's a very good business person and he hadn't put all his eggs in one basket, so his other speciality is installing lighting for posh nightclubs in Manchester. So he might have to lay some of his staff off, but he'll be able to keep a core of them, and he'll go on installing lighting in posh nightclubs in Manchester. But what he really wants to be doing is installing solar panels on people's roofs, looking at local community-owned solar farms. That's what he'd like to be doing, but we've had a government that's just pulled the rug out from underneath him, a government that's chasing after fracking, even though the arguments that when they first started talking about fracking a few years ago, you'll probably remember they were talking about, oh, we just need it as a bridging fuel. You know, a few years until renewables can kick on. But that argument just doesn't make sense anymore. Renewables have come on far faster than anyone expected. We've got now Bloomberg New Energy, you can Google this, it's a really good survey, basically showing that solar and onshore wind are now pretty well comparable in most parts of the world with coal in terms of the cost of energy generation. And Bloomberg, of course, is only talking about the cost in terms of finances. They're not counting the environmental cost, the other impacts that we all know are so great. So I've done some depressing stuff, and I'm going to do one more bit of depressing stuff before I get to all the cheerful stuff, which is I've talked about our political, economic, social and environmental crises. Well, one more thing to add to this is we have a real crisis in education. Now, the obvious area of this is obviously tuition fees. Now, even before the government's recent changes, we've actually seen a situation where 73% of students will never pay off their student debt. 50p in the pound of student debt will never be paid off. Students face leaving university with something like an average of £44,000 worth of debt. And they face going through 30 years of their life, for many of them from their mid-20s to their mid-50s, with that weight of debt on their shoulder, weighing them down. In a year they earn any sort of money at all, paying 9% of their income off towards a debt that they'll never pay off. Now that is profoundly dispiriting, but it's also, when you think about the economic impacts, those are the years when most people are usually thinking about perhaps settling down, maybe buying a house, provided they don't live in London, you know, having children, all of those costs, and yet you've got that weight of debt. And now, of course, we've just seen the government inflict this debt, or want to inflict this debt, on student midwives, student nurses, other associated health professionals. And it's a lovely example of how the government is managing to unite more and more people against them. Because early in January I was on the march with the student nurses in London, and they're a group of people who even probably 2 months before would never have thought of themselves as getting involved in politics. They've got massive amounts of work to do, they've got massive studies, they were focused on that, and then the government forced them to turn to politics. So there's another new group of people involved and engaged in politics, and they were lovely because on the march they kept kind of sidling up to me and going, "We've never done this before, are we doing it right?" And I kept saying to them, "There's 10,000 people standing behind you, you're doing absolutely fine." And of course the junior doctors. And you think about the junior doctors, this government is so playing with fire. They've been privatising our NHS, and now they seem to be trying to drive away the absolute core of the staffing. When you come to the student nurses, they're saying, oh, if we introduce fees, there'll be more student nurses. Not quite sure how that logic works. And in terms of the doctors, when I was on the picket line with the doctors, so many of them were saying to me, I already know someone in Canada, in Australia, who's left to work. There's a global shortage of healthcare workers. There's a global shortage of doctors. I'm going to think about moving. The day after Jeremy Hunt announced the imposition of doctors' contracts, 1,000% increase in the number of doctors applying to potentially go overseas. What this government's doing is not sustainable. It won't continue. It can't continue. You look at those student nurses, this really is a new low in austerity. Student nurses and midwives and others, as part of their courses, have to do, most of them, more than 2,000 hours of practical work. They're actually working in the NHS, and if they're forced to pay fees, they will actually be paying to work. That really is an absolute new low in terms of this government. It really is an extremist government, without a mandate, heading in directions that can't continue. And so that, I think, is one of the things that we really can use as a beacon of hope, in the fact that things cannot continue as they are. The status quo is profoundly unsustainable. And in the Green Party, as Mag said, last year was an amazing year. Our membership more than trebled. We got 1.1 million votes in the general election. That was more votes than we've got in every previous general election, all added together cumulatively. This year, we've got actually fair elections coming up. Elections in London, in Wales, and our sister party in Scotland. They're proportional representation elections. One of the things you'll find when you're talking about electoral reform is lots of people will tell you, oh, it's just too complicated for the voters, they'll never understand. Well, the voters of London, Wales and Scotland have got it. I think the rest of England can probably get with it too. But more than that, just because when we're thinking about electoral reform, it's really important to make a clear point. We have not previously had a vote on proportional representation. The AV referendum, the alternative vote referendum in 2011, that was for a system that wasn't proportional and would often have produced far less proportional results even than first past the post. So we haven't had a chance to vote on this. And the surveys all show that people really want electoral reform. They want a fair voting system. They want a system where they know they can vote for what they want and actually get it. So this is really exciting times, times when politics is changing fast. One of the obvious examples of this, of course, was the election of Jeremy Corbyn as Labour Party leader. He started at odds of 200 to 1. It's not just, of course, in Britain. In America, Bernie Sanders, I'll call him brother of our own Larry Sanders, our new Green Party health spokesperson and former Oxford City Councillor. Bernie Sanders, he started in the race to raise a few questions, stir things up a bit, and now he's running neck and neck with Hillary Clinton. If you look at what happened in Scotland, in the general election, there were seats in Glasgow where people would have told you a year before the election, this is a safe Labour seat. You count the Labour votes in wheelbarrows. And yet, what happened? We saw the people decide collectively that they'd had enough, that a right-wing position Labour Party, they didn't want to have them anymore, they voted for the SNP. And many of you might know Mari Black, the SNP, very young MP. She's a great MP, but I think when the SNP selected her, they probably didn't expect her to be elected. Something to think about when you're selecting your next Green candidates, wherever you're selecting them. So, the possibility of change is there. People are getting engaged more and more. One of the things that we've seen is that level of engagement. An excellent website called The Conversation was reporting some research from the University of Birmingham, talking about the level of protest, the level of political activity on the streets. And there was a graph from 2010 to 2015, and the graph sloped like that, steeply upwards. The level of political engagement, of political protest, is now back at the kind of levels that we last saw in the late 60s or early 70s. And that was even before we got the junior doctors and the nurses out on the streets. The change is in the air. We can feel that the change is coming, and boy do we need that change. But of course, one of the things that we're going to have first, and I have to refer to this because I have a horrible feeling this is going to dominate a lot of our political debate for the next 4 months, pushing aside some other very worthy things, is of course the EU referendum. We've had, I think, about 48 hours of the debate thus far, and you have to say the quality of the debate is not terribly encouraging. It seems to largely be treated at the moment as a de facto Tory leadership contest. David Cameron is clearly, in terms of the leadership, a dead man walking, and people are strutting their stuff, trying to line up for the leadership campaign. Well, I think the EU referendum is far too important for that. We can't allow that to happen. You probably mostly know that the Green Party is campaigning very strongly to remain in the EU. We had a vote at the last conference floor, more than 95% in favour of that position, because we believe that we flourish best when we work together to face the joint problems that we face. There's going to be an awful lot of nonsense talked coming up in this debate. I've already heard what might still remain right through it, one of my favourites. The Out campaign saying, that way we'll get back control of our fish. I'm not a cartoonist, but I think, a fish carrying a passport you know, maybe tucked into their belt or something, definitely cries out for some sort of image like that. You know, fish don't respect borders. Just like when you think about air pollution, water pollution, if you think about workers' rights, if one country in Europe undercuts the standards that everyone else is applying, it's really hard for others to maintain that standards. All of these things, it makes sense to do them together, collectively. And of course, there's free movement of people in the EU. And in the Green Party, we say we celebrate free movement of people in the EU. It enriches the possibility of all of our lives. And I think, you know, that's one demonstration of the way in which, in the Green Party, we have unique contributions to this debate. We need to make sure we get into it. I was actually on the Isle of Wight, a really interesting place where we got our third highest vote in the country, even though it's regarded as a safe Tory stronghold. And on the Isle of Wight I said, we celebrate free movement of people in the EU. And the local leader of UKIP was so astonished that he tweeted my words out to the world. The Greens say they celebrate free movement. And I retweeted him and said yes. Because it enriches the possibility of all of our lives. You know, students, maybe you can, when you're almost finished, get an Erasmus scholarship and go and study for a year in Rome. If you've had enough of studying, maybe you can go and au pair in Paris for a year. Maybe your local classes are enriched by people from around the EU coming in, becoming teachers. Certainly our NHS is relying very heavily on people from across the EU. These are things that enrich all of our lives. But it is also feeds into a much broader debate, and a really important point to make, because many of the people, when I knock on their doors and they say, oh, I'm concerned about immigration, and I say to them, what are you really concerned about? And they'll usually come up with three answers. They'll either say low wages, crowded schools and hospitals, or housing costs too much and my kids can't get a council house. Now, it's really important to say all of those concerns are rightful, reasonable, utterly fair concerns. But those things are not caused by immigration. They are caused by failures of government policy. And it's governments, successive governments, that have been used immigration as a scapegoat to blame those situations on that, rather than allowing the blame to let rest where it really belongs. If you think about low wages, we have an inadequate minimum wage, inadequately enforced. We're seeing some court cases coming through now from home care workers. You've got a 15-minute appointment there, a half-hour appointment there, an hour appointment there, and they're not paid travelling time in between. And they're paid less than the supposedly legal minimum wage. We've got, in terms of crowded schools and hospitals, we've got, I've already referred to the privatisation of the NHS, PFI schemes that have cost massive amounts of money. And when I come to schools, well, I can just say Michael Gove. That pretty well covers it. And then housing. We've relied on the market to provide housing for decades. The market hasn't supplied. We've sold off 1.5 million council homes under right to buy and not replaced them. We've got a failed model. It's not immigrants that are causing the problem. And you know, in the Green Party, we've got a very proud tradition of standing up for that. And boy, do we need to stand up, not just for free movement of people in the EU, but also for a decent, fair, humane immigration policy. Last week, I was with Jenny Jones, our member of the House of Lords, in Calais, at the refugee camp known as the Jungle. And there are, we know this because volunteers, charities there have counted them, no government has, about 440 children, more than 300 of them unaccompanied children. Some of those children are as young as 10. They're on their own in the middle of Europe, and no one's looking out for them except for some very hard-pressed volunteers. And quite a lot of those children actually should have the right to be in Britain. They have relatives here in Britain already under what's known as the Dublin III regulations. They have the right to be here in Britain if they could apply. But our government and the French government have ensured they have no way to apply from Calais. So the only thing that they can do is to try and smuggle themselves into Britain. And that's what a boy, a 15-year-old boy from Afghanistan did just after Christmas. Masood was his name, and I went to his memorial service. 15 years old, trapped in Calais. His sister is here legally as a refugee in Britain. He tried to smuggle himself in the back of a lorry, and he suffocated in the back of that lorry. Now that's a huge indictment of British government policy, of the way we're behaving, that simply must be highlighted, outlined, explained, and let's get the public behind us. We saw after that horrific photo of Aylan Kurdi, the 3-year-old who drowned on the beach in Greece, a huge upswelling. That's something we need to grow and develop, something we need to make part of the political change that we're pushing for. Because as I said, the status quo can't continue. We can't continue to have this fortress Europe that's locking people out. We can't continue to have a society that works for the richest 1% and not for the rest of us. We cannot continue as we are. Big change is coming, positive change. The Green Party, I was talking about some of the ideas we've already seen get much wider adoption, some more that are coming, the idea of citizens' income, universal basic income. You might have noticed suddenly everybody's talking about it, and that's been Green Party policy for decades. Land value tax, a way in which ensuring that rich people can't just sit on massive stocks of land and not allow it to be used for its best purpose. The whole issue of where our money comes from. Positive Money, an organisation that's been campaigning on this for many years. Now we've got a situation where people are starting to recognise our financial sector is one of our huge problems. It's not the solution, it's the problem. The Green Party, we've got lots of ideas, plans. We've now got lots of members, lots of new branches, new parties up and down the country. The possibilities are enormous. What I'd urge you to do is, whether you're here as a Green Party member, a prospective Green Party member, or a member of some other party, let's all get together and campaign for the real change that we desperately need. Because the future does look hopeful. There is real hope in the future. Things are going to change, and we can make Britain, the world, work for the common good within our environmental limits. Thank you.